You can't sit with us tonight, Elena. This dinner is for people who actually contribute to building empires, not for housewives who spend money. My husband Marcus delivered those words in the marble foyer of Lumiere, the most exclusive restaurant in Manhattan, while his business associates stood watching. 30 seconds later, the maitre d' approached our group with a nervous smile and said the words that would change everything. Mr. Ashford, I need to inform you that Mrs. Ashford owns this establishment. All of it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier on heavy cream cardstock with raised gold lettering that spoke of wealth and exclusivity. Marcus had brought it home from his office at Ashford Capital Management, setting it on the kitchen island where I was preparing dinner with the casual attitude of someone sharing moderately interesting information rather than extending an invitation. The Richardson Group is hosting their annual investment summit dinner, he had said, loosening his tie as he poured himself scotch from the decanter I had given him for our 5th anniversary. It is at Lumiere on the 23rd. Black tie naturally. The guest list includes everyone who matters in private equity and venture capital. This could be the connection that finally gets us into the Richardson portfolio. I had glanced at the invitation, noting that it was addressed solely to Marcus Ashford, with no mention of a guest or spouse. Will I be attending with you? I had asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear him say it. Marcus had hesitated in that particular way that men do when they are about to deliver disappointing news but want to frame it as reasonable. Actually, Elena, I think it would be better if I attended solo this time. These dinners are intensely focused on business discussions. The conversations get quite technical regarding fund structures, portfolio management, risk assessment strategies. You would probably find it rather boring, honestly. He had smiled at me then, the kind of smile that was meant to soften the exclusion, to make it seem like he was doing me a favor by sparing me from tedium. Besides, you have been saying you wanted more time to work on your projects. This gives you a free evening to focus on whatever you have been developing. Win-win, right? My projects. That was how Marcus categorized the work I had been doing for the past 6 years. Projects, as though I was an industrious hobbyist filling idle hours with activities that kept me pleasantly occupied but fundamentally inconsequential. He had no idea what those projects actually were. Had never asked for details beyond polite superficial questions that he forgot to listen to the answers for. I had not argued that evening 3 weeks ago. I had simply nodded, returned to chopping vegetables for the cocoa vin I was preparing, and made a mental note that Marcus Ashford still saw me exactly as he had seen me when we first married 7 years ago. As an ornament, a companion, a person whose value derived entirely from association with him rather than from anything I created independently. That perception was about to be corrected in the most definitive way possible. The evening of the Richardson Group dinner arrived with unseasonably warm weather for late October in Manhattan. I had spent the afternoon in final meetings with my management team, reviewing operational details and ensuring that every element would be executed flawlessly. Then I had returned to our penthouse apartment in Tribeca to prepare for the evening. Marcus had left the office early to get ready, an unusual choice that indicated how important he considered this dinner to be. I could hear him in our master bathroom, shower running, followed by the familiar sounds of his grooming routine. He emerged wearing his custom-tailored Tom Ford tuxedo, the one that had cost $7,000 and fit him with the precision that only bespoke tailoring achieved. He looked handsome objectively. Marcus was 41 years old, maintained his athletic build through regular sessions with a personal trainer, and possessed the kind of confident bearing that came from a lifetime of privilege and positive reinforcement. His dark hair showed distinguished silver at the temples. His jawline remained sharp. He wore success comfortably, like a well-broken-in jacket. I should be home by 11 or so, he said, adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror. Do not wait up if you are tired. I know you have been keeping long hours with whatever you have been working on. I was standing in the doorway of our bedroom wearing a silk robe, my hair already styled in an elegant updo, my makeup applied with the skill that came from years of attending high society events. Actually, Marcus, I will be going out this evening as well. I have plans. He glanced at me with mild surprise. Oh, dinner with the ladies? That book club you mentioned? Something like that. I replied, keeping my tone neutral and pleasant. He kissed my cheek absently, his mind already at the dinner, already calculating how to position himself with the Richardson Group representatives, already rehearsing the conversations he hoped to have. Well, have fun with your friends. Try not to let them talk you into any expensive shopping excursions. He smiled at his own joke, grabbed his wallet and keys and headed toward the door. Marcus, I called after him. He paused, turning back toward me. Which restaurant is hosting the dinner again? I have forgotten. Lumiere, he said. You know, that new place that everyone is talking about. Impossible to get reservations unless you know someone. Apparently the Richardson Group has connections with the owner. Very exclusive, very impressive. Exactly the kind of venue that signals you have arrived. That does sound impressive, I agreed. I hope you have a wonderful evening. He left, and I listened to the sound of the elevator descending from our private floor. Then I walked to my closet and selected the dress I had chosen for this evening. A floor-length gown in deep emerald silk that brought out the green in my hazel eyes, with elegant draping that suggested sophistication rather than provocation. I added the diamond earrings my grandmother had left me, delicate pieces that carried family history rather than flashy wealth. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw not Marcus Ashford's wife but Elena Vasquez Ashford, entrepreneur, restaurateur, and the architect of an empire my husband did not know existed. The car service I had arranged arrived at 7:15. My driver Thomas had been with me since I opened my first restaurant 4 years ago. He knew to take me to the service entrance of Lumiere rather than the main door. I entered through the kitchen, where my executive chef Laurent looked up from supervising the evening's preparations and smiled. Bonsoir, Madame Ashford. Everything is prepared exactly as you requested. Your husband and his party arrived 10 minutes ago. They have been seated in the private dining room on the second floor. Thank you, Laurent. And the other arrangements? All confirmed. The Richardson Group representatives are aware of the situation and are prepared to follow your lead. I nodded, feeling the familiar calm that came before executing a carefully planned strategy. Then let us begin. I made my way through the restaurant using the internal staff corridors, emerging on the main floor near the maitre d' station. Lumiere was breathtaking, even to me, and I had been instrumental in every design decision. The space occupied what had once been a historic bank building, with soaring ceilings, original marble columns, and massive windows overlooking Madison Avenue. We had preserved the architectural grandeur while adding modern elements. Custom lighting that created intimate atmospheres within the grand space, contemporary art from emerging artists, and an open kitchen concept that allowed diners to observe culinary artistry. The main dining room was filled with Manhattan's elite. Tech entrepreneurs, entertainment industry executives, fashion designers, financial titans. Every table was occupied, and I knew that we had turned away more than 200 reservation requests for this evening alone. Lumiere had become, in just 18 months since opening, the most sought-after dining destination in a city famous for extraordinary restaurants. And it was entirely mine. I had built this without Marcus's knowledge, without his financial support, without his connections or his name or any association with him whatsoever. I had done it with my own capital, my own vision, my own relationships, and my own relentless work. I had done it specifically because I needed to prove to myself that I could create value independent of being Mrs. Marcus Ashford. Now I was about to prove it to him as well. I conferred briefly with Jean-Pierre, our maitre d', who had managed some of Europe's finest establishments before I convinced him to join Lumiere. He was a consummate professional, 63 years old, with a kind of discretion and judgment that made him invaluable. Mr. Ashford's party is upstairs as planned, he confirmed. They ordered the sommelier's pairing with dinner. Mr. Ashford specifically requested our most impressive wines, price no object. He seems quite eager to demonstrate sophistication to his companions. I am sure he is, I replied. Is William Richardson here? He arrived 20 minutes ago with his senior partners. They are having cocktails in the lounge. Mr. Richardson asked me to inform you when you arrived. He said, and I quote, I am very much looking forward to watching this unfold. I smiled. William Richardson was 71 years old, a legendary figure in private equity, who had built his firm into a powerhouse managing $40 billion across multiple funds. He was also my godfather, my late father's closest friend and business partner, and the man who had provided the initial capital that allowed me to open my first restaurant. William had known Marcus socially for years and had never been impressed. That young man has the confidence of someone who was born on third base but thinks he hit a triple, William had told me during one of our regular lunches. He trades on his family name and his father's connections, but I have never seen evidence that he has built anything himself. Be careful, Elena. Men like that often cannot handle being married to women who outshine them. William had been correct, though it had taken me years to fully accept that assessment. Marcus had not started our marriage intending to diminish me. The diminishment had happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, as his own career had stagnated while my hidden ventures flourished. He had needed to maintain his self-image as the successful one, the builder, the person who mattered in rooms where decisions were made. Acknowledging my accomplishments would have required reconsidering that self-image in uncomfortable ways. So he had simply chosen not to see my accomplishments at all. I made my way to the lounge where William Richardson sat with three of his senior partners, all of them men in their 60s and 70s who had spent decades at the highest levels of finance and business. They rose when I approached, and William embraced me warmly. "Elena, my dear, you look absolutely radiant. And your restaurant, I must say again, is extraordinary. We have dined here 3 times in the past month alone. The Dover sole last week was transcendent." "Thank you, William. Laurent will be pleased to hear that. He sources the fish personally from a supplier in Brittany." I greeted his partners, men I had known since childhood through my father's business relationships. They treated me with genuine respect, as an accomplished professional rather than as someone's decorative spouse. "So," William said, his eyes twinkling with anticipation, "Marcus is upstairs with a group of his colleagues, I understand. And he has no idea that you own this establishment?" "None whatsoever. He thinks I spend my days in leisurely pursuits appropriate for someone of my station." I kept my tone light, but there was an edge beneath the words that everyone present recognized. William's expression grew more serious. "Elena, I want you to know that the invitation Marcus received tonight was entirely his own doing. He has been pursuing meetings with our firm for 2 years, sending proposals and requesting audiences. We have been polite but non-committal because, frankly, his fund's performance has been mediocre, and we saw no compelling reason to invest. However, when you mentioned last month that Marcus had been particularly dismissive about your work, I thought perhaps this dinner might provide an educational opportunity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I appreciate your support, William. Truly. But I want to be clear that what happens tonight is not about revenge or humiliation for its own sake. It is about establishing reality. Marcus needs to understand who I actually am rather than who he has decided I am. If that understanding comes with some discomfort, well, growth often requires discomfort. One of William's partners, a distinguished man named Robert Chun, spoke up. "For what it is worth, Elena, I have watched you build your restaurant group over these past years. The fact that you now own 4 establishments, all highly successful, all operated with exceptional standards, while maintaining complete operational secrecy from your husband, demonstrates strategic capability that most of our portfolio companies would envy. You should be very proud of what you have accomplished." For establishments, that was the full scope of what I had built in 6 years. Lumiere was the flagship, the crown jewel, but it was supported by 3 other restaurants that I had opened sequentially, each one building on the success of the previous. I owned them outright, no partners, no investors beyond William's initial loan that I had repaid within 18 months. I employed 237 people. My restaurants had been featured in the New York Times, Bon Appetit, and Food and Wine. Last year, my restaurant group had generated $17 million in revenue with healthy profit margins. And Marcus thought I spent my time having lunch with friends and occasionally volunteering at charity events. "Shall we proceed with this evening's agenda?" William asked, rising from his seat. "I believe Marcus and his associates are waiting for us to join them for dinner." We made our way to the private second-floor dining room, a space that could accommodate up to 20 guests in an environment of quiet luxury. The room featured original architectural details from the building's history as a bank, including an extraordinary coffered ceiling and a fireplace with a marble mantel that had been restored to its 1920s glory. Marcus was holding court at the head of a long table, surrounded by 8 of his colleagues from various investment firms. They were all men in their late 30s to mid-40s, uniformly dressed in expensive suits, uniformly confident in their importance. They had that particular energy of people who believed they were on the cusp of accessing the next level of professional success and social status. Marcus was in the middle of an anecdote about a recent deal, gesturing with his wine glass for emphasis, when William Richardson and his partners entered the room. The change in atmosphere was immediate and palpable. Marcus and his colleagues rose immediately, their body language shifting from casual confidence to something more deferential and eager. "Mr. Richardson," Marcus said, extending his hand with a smile that was carefully calibrated to project warmth without overfamiliarity. "Thank you so much for including us this evening. This is a tremendous honor, and I speak for everyone here when I say we are deeply grateful for the opportunity to connect with you and your colleagues." William shook Marcus's hand with professional courtesy. "The pleasure is ours, Marcus. We are always interested in meeting ambitious professionals in the investment community. However, I should mention that we are still waiting for one member of our party to arrive before we begin dinner." "Of course," Marcus said quickly. "We are in no rush. Please take your seats. Can we offer you wine? The sommelier has selected some remarkable bottles." It was at that moment that I entered the private dining room. Marcus saw me immediately, and his expression cycled through confusion, surprise, and then something approaching concern. He clearly had not expected to encounter his wife at this dinner. The other men in the room turned to look at me, some with polite curiosity, others with the appreciative glances that men often direct toward attractive women in elegant settings. "Elena," Marcus said, his tone uncertain. "What are you doing here?" "Good evening, Marcus," I replied calmly, walking further into the room. William and his partners smiled at me with knowing warmth. Marcus glanced between me and the Richardson Group representatives, trying to make sense of the situation. "I do not understand. Did you follow me here? This is a private business dinner, darling. It is really not appropriate for you to interrupt." The condescension in his voice, the casual assumption that I had somehow tracked him down like an insecure wife checking up on her husband, crystallized everything wrong with our relationship in a single sentence. He could not conceive of any legitimate reason for my presence, so he defaulted to assuming inappropriate behavior on my part. "Actually," William Richardson interjected smoothly, "Elena is not interrupting Marcus. She is our final guest. In fact, she is the reason we are all here this evening." Marcus laughed, the confused laugh of someone who thinks there must be a misunderstanding. "I am sorry, William, but I think there is some confusion. Elena is my wife. She does not have any connection to private equity or investment management. She is not involved in business at this level." "You are correct that Elena is your wife," William agreed. "However, you are dramatically incorrect about her involvement in business. Elena, perhaps you would like to clarify the situation?" Every person in the room was now looking at me with rapt attention. Marcus's colleagues appeared confused but intrigued. Marcus himself looked increasingly uncomfortable, as though he was beginning to suspect that something was unfolding that he had not anticipated and could not control. I took a breath, feeling the weight of this moment. 6 years of hidden work, of building an empire in shadows, of being dismissed and underestimated and treated as though my existence derived value solely from my marriage, all converged into this single point of revelation. "Marcus," I said quietly, my voice steady and clear, "I need to tell you something about the restaurant where we are currently dining." He waited, his jaw tight, his eyes wary. "I own Lumiere. All of it. I conceived it, I financed it, I built it, and I operate it. This restaurant, along with 3 others in Manhattan, comprises the Vasquez Restaurant Group. I am the sole proprietor and chief executive. I have been building this company for 6 years, starting 2 years before we married. The business is valued at $43 million and generates substantial annual profits. Every detail of this space, from the architectural restoration to the menu to the staff we employ, exists because I created it." The silence that followed was absolute and profound. I watched Marcus's face as he processed what I had just said. Watched him move through disbelief toward the unwilling recognition that I was stating simple fact. His colleagues stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to admiration to something that looked like concern about the implications of this revelation for Marcus personally. William Richardson spoke into the silence. Marcus, I want to be very clear about something. The Richardson Group has never had any particular interest in Ashford Capital Management. Your fund's performance is mediocre, your investment thesis is derivative, and frankly, you bring nothing unique to the market. We have been polite in our responses to your inquiries because your father was a business associate years ago, but we have no intention of investing with your firm. Marcus's face flushed. Whether from anger or humiliation I could not tell. However, William continued, we have been in preliminary discussions with Elena about providing growth capital for the Vasquez Restaurant Group's expansion plans. She has built something genuinely impressive, and we believe there are opportunities to scale her model to additional markets. That is the actual business being discussed this evening. You and your colleagues are here because Elena asked me to extend the invitation as a courtesy to her husband. She thought you might benefit from understanding what she has actually been doing while you assumed she was occupying herself with trivial pursuits. I watched Marcus absorb this information, watched him realize that he was not the center of this evening's agenda, but rather a supporting character in a story that had never been about him at all. His colleagues shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain about how to respond to the sudden reversal of their expectations about the evening. One of Marcus's associates, a man named David something whom I had met briefly at a charity event, spoke up. Mrs. Ashford, I have to say, this is extraordinary. Lumiere has been on my reservation list for months. I had no idea this was your establishment. Congratulations on building something so successful. Thank you, I replied. I appreciate that. Marcus finally found his voice. Elena, I think we need to discuss this privately. This is not the appropriate venue for family conversations. Actually, Marcus, I disagree. This is exactly the appropriate venue because this is my venue. These are my partners, my colleagues, my professional environment. You have spent years keeping me excluded from your professional world, telling me that business discussions were too complex or too boring for me, treating my work as irrelevant hobbies. Tonight, you are going to experience what it feels like to be included in a professional environment where you are not the authority, where your expertise is not valued, where the success in the room belongs to someone else entirely. The words came out more forcefully than I had planned, carrying the accumulated frustration of years of dismissal. But I did not regret them. They were true and they needed to be said. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You deliberately deceived me. You built an entire business and kept it secret. What kind of marriage involves that level of deception? The kind of marriage, I replied steadily, where one partner is never asked about their activities, never invited to share their accomplishments, never treated as capable of contributing anything meaningful beyond social decoration. I did not hide this from you, Marcus. I simply stopped trying to make you see me. There is a difference. William Richardson stood as well, his voice carrying quiet authority. Gentlemen, I think this evening's business dinner has reached its conclusion. Marcus, I suggest you and your wife take time to discuss your personal matters privately. We will leave you to that conversation. Elena, thank you for your hospitality. As always, the food has been exceptional, and the company even more so. He and his partners excused themselves with professional grace, nodding to me with warmth and to Marcus with polite formality. Marcus's colleagues followed, clearly uncomfortable and eager to escape the charged atmosphere. And then Marcus and I were alone in the private dining room of my restaurant, with the ruins of his assumptions scattered between us like broken glass. The silence in the private dining room stretched between Marcus and me like an ocean. He remained standing, his hands gripping the back of his chair with enough force that his knuckles had turned white. His face had cycled through several shades of red before settling into a pale, tightly controlled expression that I recognized as his attempt to master overwhelming emotion through sheer willpower. I remained seated, my posture relaxed but alert, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I had imagined this confrontation dozens of times over the past months, rehearsing various versions in my mind during sleepless nights when the weight of maintaining my secret had felt particularly heavy. Now that the moment had finally arrived, I felt unexpectedly calm. The truth was spoken. The revelation was complete. Whatever happened next would unfold according to its own logic, and I had prepared for multiple possibilities. Marcus finally broke the silence, his voice low and strained. How long have you been planning this humiliation? Was this entire evening orchestrated specifically to make me look like a fool in front of the Richardson group? I considered his question carefully before responding, recognizing that my answer would set the tone for everything that followed. I did not plan to humiliate you, Marcus. I planned to reveal reality. Those are different objectives with different motivations. If you feel humiliated, that is a consequence of the gap between how you perceived our marriage and what our marriage actually was. I am not responsible for maintaining your comfortable illusions at the expense of my own erasure. He released the chair and began pacing, a habit he had when processing difficult information. 3 steps toward the window, pivot, 3 steps back toward the fireplace. His movements were sharp and agitated, betraying the carefully controlled facade he tried to maintain. Erasure. That is absurdly dramatic, Elena. I have supported you throughout our marriage. I have provided you with a lifestyle that most women would be grateful for. You have never wanted for anything. Accept recognition, I said quietly. Accept respect. Accept the basic acknowledgement that I am capable of creating value independent of being your wife. Marcus stopped pacing and turned to face me directly. You created an entire business empire, apparently quite successfully based on what William Richardson said, and you never told me. Not once. You came home every day and pretended you had spent your time doing trivial things while actually operating multiple restaurants. That is not erasure, Elena. That is deliberate deception. And it speaks to a fundamental dishonesty in our relationship. I stood then, needing to meet his accusation from equal physical positioning rather than looking up from my chair. Would you like to know when I decided to stop trying to include you in my professional life? I can tell you the exact moment. It was 4 years ago, 3 years into our marriage. I had just received notification that my first restaurant, a small bistro in the West Village called Maison Verde, had received a starred review from the New York Times. It was a significant achievement, the kind of recognition that established restaurateurs work their entire careers to receive, and I had earned it within 8 months of opening. I paused, watching Marcus's face as I continued. I was so excited to share the news with you. I remember rushing home with a copy of the newspaper, planning how I would tell you, imagining your pride and excitement. When you arrived that evening, I showed you the review. I handed you the paper and said, "Marcus, look at this. The Times reviewed my restaurant and gave it a star. This is a really big accomplishment." The memory was still vivid, still painful even after 4 years. You glanced at the article for perhaps 10 seconds, nodded absently and said, "That is nice, darling. Good for you." Then you immediately changed the subject to tell me about a new client your firm had signed. You spoke for 20 minutes about this client, about the deal terms, about how impressive it was that you had convinced them to work with Ashford Capital. You never asked me a single question about my restaurant. Not about how I had financed it or built the team or developed the concept. Nothing. The conversation lasted less than a minute before it became about you again. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, perhaps recognizing that denying or minimizing the memory would only prove my point. That was the moment I understood that you were not capable of seeing me as anything other than an appendage to your life. Your wife. Your companion at social events. The person who managed our household and kept your personal life running smoothly, so you could focus on your career. Any accomplishment I achieved would either be invisible to you, or would be perceived as somehow threatening rather than as something to celebrate together. I walked toward the window overlooking Madison Avenue, looking down at the flow of taxis and pedestrians, the constant motion of the city that had become the backdrop to my hidden empire. After that evening, I stopped telling you about my work. I stopped mentioning meetings or challenges or successes. When you asked how my day was, I gave you the answers you wanted to hear. Lunch with friends, shopping, a yoga class, volunteer work, all the acceptable activities for a woman in my position. And you accepted those answers without question because they confirmed your understanding of who I was supposed to be. Marcus moved to stand beside me at the window, though he maintained careful distance, as if proximity might make this conversation more difficult. His reflection in the glass showed a man struggling with information that contradicted fundamental assumptions about his life. Why did you marry me if you thought I was incapable of respecting your ambitions? It was a fair question, one I had asked myself repeatedly over the years. Because when we first met, I genuinely believed we could build something together. I believed the partnership you described during our courtship was real. I believed that your encouragement of my interests and talents was sincere rather than performative. I turned away from the window to face him directly. Do you remember how we met, Marcus? It was at that charity gala for the Museum of Modern Art. I was there because I had helped organize the event's catering, working with the planning committee to design a menu that would showcase emerging culinary talent. You were there as a donor, networking with other wealthy attendees. We started talking, and you seemed genuinely interested when I explained my passion for the restaurant industry, my vision for creating dining experiences that combined exceptional food with meaningful hospitality. The memory was bittersweet, colored now by the knowledge of how our relationship had evolved. You told me that you admired ambitious women, that you found traditional gender roles limiting and outdated. You said you wanted a partner who had her own professional identity, rather than someone who existed solely as a reflection of your status. Those words mattered to me, Marcus. They made me believe that marrying you would not require giving up my own ambitions. Marcus's expression shifted slightly, perhaps recognizing his younger self in the description I provided. I meant those things when I said them. I believe you did, I acknowledged. But meaning something and actually living it are different challenges. When we were dating, my ambitions were theoretical and distant. They did not compete with your identity or threaten your self-perception. Once we married and my work became real rather than aspirational, once I began achieving concrete success, the dynamic changed. You needed to be the successful one in our marriage. That need, whether conscious or unconscious, required minimizing or ignoring my accomplishments. I returned to the table where our untouched place settings remained, picking up my water glass and taking a slow sip to give us both a moment to process. I should tell you how all of this actually began, how I built what you discovered tonight. You deserve to understand the full story, even if it makes you uncomfortable. Marcus returned to the table as well, sitting down heavily as though the evening's revelations had physically exhausted him. Please. I want to understand how my wife created a $43 million business without my knowledge. I sat across from him, our positioning oddly formal and distant for a married couple, having what was likely the most important conversation of our relationship. It started before we even met, with my father and the inheritance he left me. You knew my father died when I was 23, but you never asked about the details of his estate or what I inherited. If you had asked, I would have told you that my father was not just a successful businessman as you assumed, but that he was a founding partner in one of the most profitable import-export companies on the West Coast. When he died, his share of that company was liquidated and the proceeds were divided between my mother and me. Marcus's eyes widened slightly. This was clearly information he had never known or considered. How much? After taxes and estate settlement, my inheritance was approximately $11 million. My mother received a similar amount. I was 23 years old, grief-stricken over losing my father, and suddenly in possession of more money than I had ever imagined having. My father's best friend and business partner, William Richardson, became the executor of the estate and my informal financial advisor. He encouraged me to invest the money wisely rather than spending it on lifestyle inflation. I smiled at the memory of those early conversations with William, his patient guidance as I navigated grief and sudden wealth simultaneously. William suggested that I consider entrepreneurship, rather than traditional investments. He said my father had always been most successful when he was building things rather than simply managing assets. He asked me what I was passionate about, what I could imagine dedicating years of my life to creating. The restaurant industry, Marcus said quietly, beginning to understand. Exactly. I had always loved food, loved the way restaurants could create community and connection, loved the intersection of creativity and hospitality that defines excellent dining experiences. I spent a year after my father's death working in restaurants, learning the industry from every angle. I was a hostess, a server, a line cook, a sous chef. I staged in kitchens all over the city, working for free just to learn from talented chefs. I took courses in restaurant management, studied food cost analysis, learned about wine programs and beverage operations. The memories of that year were among my most cherished, a time when I had been building skills and knowledge with single-minded focus. By the time I was 24, I had both the capital and the knowledge to open my first restaurant. William helped me structure the financing, making a loan that allowed me to preserve most of my inheritance while still having enough capital to launch properly. Maison Verde opened 6 months before I met you. It was small, only 38 seats, but it was entirely mine. I had conceived the concept, designed the space, hired the team, and created the menu in collaboration with my chef. Marcus listened intently now, perhaps beginning to recognize how little he actually knew about the woman he had married. And you never mentioned this during our entire courtship? I mentioned it repeatedly, I corrected gently. I told you I owned a restaurant. I invited you to visit. You came once, stayed for an hour, and never asked to return. You seemed uncomfortable the entire time, as though you did not understand why I would be involved in something you perceived as service industry work, rather than a legitimate business venture. After that visit, I stopped pressing you to be involved because your discomfort was obvious. I could see Marcus searching his memory, perhaps trying to recall details he had dismissed as unimportant at the time. When we married, I signed a prenuptial agreement that you said was standard financial protection. I did not read it carefully because I trusted you and because I assumed it was protecting your family money. I never questioned what assets you were bringing into the marriage because the prenup conversation felt awkward and unromantic. I was focused on the wedding, on starting our life together, on the emotional dimensions of marriage rather than the practical details. Marcus's voice carried a hint of defensiveness. You deliberately kept me ignorant about your financial situation. I provided complete financial disclosure as required by the prenuptial agreement, I said firmly. Every asset I owned was listed in the documentation that your attorney reviewed. If you chose not to read those documents carefully, that was your decision. I did not hide information. I simply did not insist that you pay attention to details you clearly considered unimportant. The distinction mattered because it illuminated a larger pattern. Marcus had assumed that financial power in our marriage resided with him. He came from a wealthy family, managed an investment fund, and moved in circles where wealth signaled importance. My financial independence had been invisible to him because he had never bothered to look for it, had never considered that I might possess resources and capabilities independent of our marriage. After we married, I continued, I opened my second restaurant using profits from Maison Verde plus additional capital from my inheritance. This was within our first year of marriage. The new restaurant, called Corbeau Noir, was in Midtown and targeted a different clientele. More upscale, more focused on business dinners and expense account dining. It was successful from opening night. I stood and moved toward the fireplace, where flames provided warmth and ambient light that softened the stark revelations of the evening. I was working 16-hour days during this period, managing 2 restaurants simultaneously, hiring and training staff, developing systems that would allow me to scale operations. You never asked why I was so busy. You never questioned where I was spending my time. When I came home exhausted, you assumed I had been shopping or having lengthy lunches. It never occurred to you that I might be working as hard as you were, building something as demanding as your career. Marcus's silence was answer enough. He had not questioned because my activities had not interested him beyond whether I would be available for the social obligations and domestic support that he expected from a wife. The third restaurant opened 2 years ago, Terre Timere in Brooklyn. That location required convincing investors that Brooklyn could support fine dining at the price points I needed to make the concept profitable. I spent months developing financial projections, studying demographic trends, identifying the specific neighborhood where young professionals with disposable income were creating demand for elevated dining experiences. That restaurant is now the highest grossing location in my group. I returned to the table, sitting down once more and meeting Marcus's eyes directly. And then 18 months ago I opened Lumiere. This was the most ambitious project I had attempted. The building alone required 15 months of renovation. The capital investment was substantial. I brought in partners for the first time, though I retained majority ownership. William Richardson's firm provided mezzanine financing. I hired the best executive chef I could find, stole the best maitre d' from a 3 Michelin star restaurant in Paris, and created something I believed could compete with any restaurant in the world. Pride colored my voice as I described Lumiere, the culmination of 6 years of learning and building. We received a 2-star review from the New York Times within 4 months of opening. We were featured in Bon Appetit's list of the year's best new restaurants. Forbes included me in their list of innovative entrepreneurs under 40, though I declined to be interviewed because I was not ready for public visibility. Every metric that defines success in this industry we have achieved. Marcus absorbed this information with an expression that combined shock, confusion, and something that might have been reluctant admiration. $43 million in total value across 4 restaurants. 237 employees. You did all of this while I thought you were living a life of leisure. I did all of this while you needed to believe I was living a life of leisure, I corrected. Those are different things. Your identity required me to be the successful one, the builder, the person whose career deserved priority and attention. Acknowledging my success would have required reconsidering that identity. So you simply chose not to see what I was building. The words were harsh but accurate, and I delivered them without malice. This was not about attacking Marcus but about establishing truth. Our marriage had been built on convenient fictions that I had enabled by hiding my work rather than forcing him to confront his assumptions. I owned my role in creating that dynamic even as I recognized that his need for those fictions had made my choices feel necessary. Why now? Marcus asked finally. Why reveal everything tonight in front of William Richardson and my colleagues? Why not tell me privately? Give me the chance to process this information without public humiliation. I had anticipated this question and had my answer prepared. Because private conversations between us have been ineffective. For 4 years I have tried to share aspects of my work with you. You dismissed every attempt. You changed subjects, minimized accomplishments, or simply did not listen. Tonight was not about humiliating you. It was about creating a situation where you could not dismiss or ignore reality. William Richardson and his partners know exactly what I have built. They respect my work. Their presence made denial impossible. I leaned forward, willing Marcus to understand the deeper point. You needed witnesses who would validate my reality, rather than supporting your illusions. If I had told you privately that I owned this restaurant, you would have found ways to minimize it. You would have suggested that I was overstating my role, or that the business was not as successful as I claimed, or that owning restaurants was somehow less impressive than managing an investment fund. With William Richardson confirming the facts, you had to accept them as true. Marcus sat back in his chair, his body language defensive but no longer openly combative. What happens now? Do we divorce? Is that what you want? Was this entire revelation designed to establish grounds for ending our marriage with favorable terms? The question revealed his assumptions about my motivations, his belief that this must be about financial positioning for divorce rather than about genuinely wanting him to see me clearly. I do not want divorce, Marcus. At least not necessarily. What I want is an actual marriage based on mutual respect rather than comfortable illusions. I want a partner who recognizes that I am capable and accomplished rather than someone who needs me to be less than I am so he can feel more than he is. I stood and moved toward the door, recognizing that we had reached the natural end of this conversation for tonight. Further discussion would become circular and unproductive. Marcus needed time to process, to adjust his understanding of our relationship, to decide whether he could accept the reality I had presented. You should go home, Marcus. Think about everything you learned tonight. Think about whether you actually want to be married to the woman I am rather than the woman you imagined I was. We can talk more tomorrow when we have both had time to reflect. Marcus rose as well, his movements slower and less certain than his usual confident bearing. Where will you be tonight? I will stay here. I have an office upstairs where I sometimes sleep when I am working late. I need space to process this evening as well, and I think we both need separation right now. He nodded slowly, perhaps relieved not to have to navigate the intimacy of our shared apartment after such a fundamental shift in our relationship. He collected his coat from where Jean-Pierre had hung it when he arrived, then paused at the doorway. Elena, regardless of how angry or confused I feel right now, I want you to know that what you have built is genuinely impressive. I should have seen it. I should have paid attention. My failure to do so speaks to my limitations, not to any lack of worth on your part. The acknowledgement was not enough to repair years of dismissal, but it was a beginning. Thank you for saying that. It matters. He left, and I was alone in the private dining room of my restaurant, surrounded by the physical evidence of everything I had created while remaining invisible in my own marriage. The irony was sharp. I had built an empire specifically because I needed to prove to myself that I could create value independent of being Marcus Ashford's wife. In doing so, I had created a separate life so complete that my husband had no idea who I actually was. I walked through Lumiere's empty dining room after the last guests had departed, my footsteps echoing on marble floors that I had personally selected from a quarry in Vermont. Every detail of this space reflected decisions I had made, standards I had established, vision I had executed. The custom light fixtures from a designer in Milan, the artwork from emerging contemporary artists whose work I had discovered in small galleries, the chairs that I had tested personally for comfort during lengthy meals, the acoustics that allowed conversation to feel intimate, even in a large space. This restaurant was mine in ways that transcended legal ownership. It was an extension of my creativity, my values, my understanding of what dining experiences could be at their best. And I had created it in secret, building an empire in shadows because the person who should have been my closest ally had needed me to be small so he could feel large. The parallel to the story I had read about the tech founder and her CEO husband was not lost on me. Different industries, different specifics, but the same fundamental dynamic. Women building, creating, innovating while the men in their lives took credit, minimized contributions, or simply remained willfully blind to accomplishments that complicated their self-perception. I had prepared for this revelation the same way the tech founder had prepared for her eventual confrontation. Documentation, strategic planning, careful relationship building, alternative value creation that provided leverage and options. I had studied that story and others like it, recognizing patterns that transcended individual circumstances. The preparation phase was crucial because it transformed potential victimhood into strategic positioning. But unlike the tech founder's story, which had focused on corporate structures and intellectual property, my leverage came from a different source. I had built something entirely independent of Marcus. My success did not depend on him acknowledging it. My worth was not contingent on his recognition. I had proven to myself what I was capable of, and that self-knowledge was the real victory. The question now was whether Marcus could accept being married to someone whose accomplishments exceeded his own, whose professional identity was stronger than his, whose financial independence meant she did not need him for anything beyond the emotional partnership of marriage itself. That was a different kind of test, one that would reveal whether our marriage had any foundation beyond the comfortable fictions we had both maintained. I climbed the stairs to my private office on the 3rd floor, a space that Marcus had never seen and did not know existed. The office was elegantly appointed but functional, with a desk made from reclaimed wood, shelves lined with cookbooks and business texts, and a small seating area where I conducted meetings with my management team. One wall displayed framed articles and reviews, the public recognition of work that my husband had never noticed. I changed out of my elegant gown and into comfortable clothes I kept in the office for nights when I worked late. Then I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, reviewing tomorrow's reservations and noting 3 special requests that required my personal attention. A marriage proposal that needed coordinating with the kitchen for ring presentation in a chocolate dessert. A 50th wedding anniversary celebration that deserved special recognition from our team. A birthday dinner for a prominent food critic whose review could influence our reputation significantly. This was my life. This was the work I did. These small moments of creating meaningful experiences for people celebrating important occasions. And I was extraordinarily good at it, had built a thriving enterprise around the fundamental belief that hospitality mattered, that food could create connection, that restaurants at their best were not just about sustenance but about community and celebration and the simple joy of gathering with others. Marcus had missed all of it because he had never bothered to look. The question was whether he could learn to see me now, or whether the comfortable illusions had been so fundamental to our marriage that truth made the relationship unsustainable. I would discover the answer soon enough. But tonight, sitting alone in my office surrounded by evidence of everything I had built, I felt something I had not experienced in years of my marriage. I felt proud of myself without qualification or diminishment. I felt powerful in the way that comes from knowing your worth is self-evident rather than dependent on external validation. And I felt free from the exhausting performance of being less than I was so someone else could feel comfortable being less than they should be. Whatever happened with Marcus, whatever our marriage ultimately became or failed to become, I had reclaimed myself tonight. And that reclamation was worth whatever difficult conversations and hard truths lay ahead. I woke at 6 the following morning in the small bedroom adjacent to my office, a space I had furnished specifically for nights when leaving the restaurant felt impractical or undesirable. The bed was comfortable, the linens were high quality, and the room had everything I needed for basic self-care. I had spent perhaps 40 nights here over the past 18 months, usually after particularly demanding service shifts or when solving operational problems required my presence well past midnight. Marcus had never questioned these absences. When I did not come home, he assumed I was staying with friends or had decided to sleep in our guest room after coming home late and not wanting to disturb him. His lack of curiosity about my whereabouts had once bothered me. Now I recognized it as emblematic of our fundamental dynamic. He did not ask questions because he did not want to know answers that might complicate his comfortable assumptions. I showered in the small bathroom, dressed in clothes I kept in the office closet for exactly these situations, and went downstairs to find Laurent already at work in the kitchen. He was 53 years old, a third-generation chef who had trained in Lyon before working in Michelin-starred establishments across Europe. I had convinced him to join Lumiere by offering him complete creative control over the menu, competitive compensation that reflected his expertise, and partnership in the form of profit sharing that made him invested in the restaurant's success, rather than merely employed by it. "Bonjour, madame," he greeted me, looking up from the fish he was examining with critical attention. "I trust you slept adequately despite the dramatic events of last evening?" Laurent had worked for me long enough to understand that last night's revelation to Marcus had been years in the making. We had discussed it during our strategic planning sessions, though Laurent had questioned whether revealing everything so publicly was wise or necessary. His concern had been protective rather than judgmental, the worry of someone who cared about my well-being beyond our professional relationship. "I slept well enough, thank you. The halibut looks exceptional this morning." Direct from a supplier in Brittany who understands that freshness is not negotiable. "We will prepare it simply tonight, perhaps with brown butter and capers, allowing the fish to speak for itself rather than overwhelming it with technique." He set down the fillet and wiped his hands on his apron. "May I ask how your husband responded to learning about his wife's hidden empire?" The question carried gentle humor but genuine interest. Laurent had met Marcus exactly twice in 4 years, both times when Marcus had briefly visited Lumiere during its construction phase before opening. Marcus had been uncomfortable in the kitchen environment, clearly uncertain about how to interact with the workers and contractors, and had left quickly both times. Laurent had observed those visits with the sharp attention he brought to everything and had later commented that my husband seemed like a man more comfortable with abstractions than with the tangible work of building things. Marcus was shocked as expected, also confused and somewhat defensive. He questioned why I had kept this hidden rather than immediately accepting his own role in making secrecy feel necessary. "We will need to have additional conversations about the future of our marriage, but those conversations will wait until he has processed the initial revelations." Laurent nodded thoughtfully, returning his attention to the morning's deliveries. "Marriage is complex, non? We believe we know our partners, we believe they know us, and then we discover that we have been living parallel lives that intersect only superficially. My first marriage ended because my wife could not accept that I was married to my work as much as to her. My second marriage thrives because my wife understands that a chef's devotion to cuisine is not rejection of partnership, but rather an expression of identity that must be honored for the partnership to be authentic." His words resonated with my own situation, though the specifics differed. Marcus had wanted a wife who supported his ambitions without possessing equally demanding ambitions of her own. He had needed me to be a certain kind of partner, and when I could not be that partner without betraying myself, I had simply hidden who I actually was rather than forcing him to confront the gap between his needs and my reality. "Perhaps," Laurent continued, "your husband will discover that being married to a woman of genuine accomplishment is more satisfying than being married to the illusion of a woman who exists primarily to support his self-perception. Or perhaps he will discover that his ego cannot tolerate equality. Either discovery is valuable, even if one leads to divorce and the other to a renewed marriage built on honesty. I appreciated Laurent's directness. He was French in the way that Americans often stereotyped, which meant he valued honest assessment over comforting platitudes. His perspective was untainted by social niceties or concerns about saying things that might be uncomfortable to hear. He spoke truth as he understood it, and I had learned to value that quality in our working relationship. I need to go home this morning and have a proper conversation with Marcus. We cannot resolve years of accumulated deception and dismissal in a single evening. But I also need to ensure that operations here continue smoothly regardless of what is happening in my personal life. Can you manage service tonight without my presence if necessary? Madam, I have managed service for 30 years. Lumiere will operate flawlessly whether you are physically present or not. You have built excellent systems and hired exceptional staff. Trust the infrastructure you have created rather than believing that your personal presence is essential for every shift. That is the difference between being a chef and being an owner. Chefs must be present for their kitchens to function. Owners must build organizations that function independently of their constant attention. The distinction was important and reflected a lesson I had learned gradually over 6 years of building my restaurant group. Early in my career, I had believed that my personal involvement in every detail was necessary for success. I had worked punishing hours, been present for every service, and made myself indispensable to daily operations. That approach had been unsustainable and had prevented scaling beyond a single location. Learning to delegate, to hire people more skilled than myself in specific domains, to create systems and standards that others could execute without my constant supervision, these capabilities had been essential for growing from 1 restaurant to 4. I had studied business operations, consulted with successful restaurateurs, and forced myself to let go of the belief that excellence required my personal involvement in every decision. The result was an organization that could function effectively, even when I was dealing with personal crises, or focusing attention on strategic initiatives, rather than daily operations. That organizational strength was about to be tested as I navigated whatever came next with Marcus. I left Lumiere through the service entrance, the same path I had used the previous evening, and took a taxi back to our Tribeca apartment. The morning traffic was heavy, giving me 40 minutes to consider how to approach the conversation waiting for me. Marcus would have spent the night processing shock, anger, confusion, and hopefully some degree of self-reflection about his role in creating the situation we now faced. The question was whether he possessed the emotional capacity and intellectual honesty to accept responsibility for his failures without deflecting blame or minimizing the harm his dismissiveness had caused. Many people, when confronted with evidence of their own shortcomings, defaulted to defensive reactions that protected their self-image at the expense of genuine reckoning. If Marcus responded that way, our marriage was likely finished because I would not accept continued erasure regardless of how uncomfortable my visibility made him. I entered our apartment building, greeted the doorman who had known me for 7 years without knowing anything real about my life, and took the elevator to our penthouse floor. The apartment was quiet when I entered, with no immediate evidence of Marcus's presence. I found him eventually in his home office, sitting at his desk surrounded by papers and looking as though he had not slept. He looked up when I entered, his expression difficult to read. Exhaustion certainly, but also something that might have been resignation or determination or perhaps both simultaneously. I have been reviewing our prenuptial agreement, he said without preamble, gesturing toward the papers spread across his desk. You were right that full financial disclosure was provided. Every asset you own was listed, including ownership of Maison Verde. I signed without reading carefully because my attorney assured me the agreement was standard, and because I was not particularly interested in the financial details. He paused, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. I have also been reviewing articles about your restaurants. There are dozens of them, Elena. Reviews, features, profiles. The New York Times has written about you 4 separate times. Forbes included you in their list of innovative entrepreneurs. Food and Wine called you one of the most exciting restaurateurs working today. All of this information was publicly available, and I never encountered any of it because I never looked. The admission hung in the air between us, a confession of willful ignorance that went beyond simple oversight into active avoidance. Marcus had constructed a reality where I was a certain kind of person, and he had unconsciously filtered out any information that contradicted that construction. I have been trying to understand how this happened, he continued, his voice carrying genuine confusion beneath the exhaustion. How I could be married to someone for 7 years and not know fundamental facts about her professional life. I keep wanting to blame you for hiding things, but the truth is that you did not hide them so much as I refused to see them. Those are different failures with different implications. I sat down in the chair across from his desk, maintaining the same physical distance we had established the previous evening. The human mind is remarkably efficient at filtering information that creates cognitive dissonance. You needed to believe that you were the successful partner, the builder, the one whose career deserved priority and attention. Evidence that contradicted that belief was unconsciously dismissed as irrelevant or unimportant. It is a common psychological defense mechanism, though that does not make its effects less harmful to the person being erased. Marcus nodded slowly, accepting the assessment without immediately defending himself. I spoke with my father this morning very early, after I had been up most of the night. I needed perspective from someone who has been married for 40 years, and might understand dynamics that I am only beginning to recognize. Do you know what he told me? I waited, curious about what wisdom Marcus's father might have offered. Richard Ashford was 71 years old, a semi-retired investment banker who had built substantial wealth through careful career management and strategic positioning. He had always been cordial to me but distant, treating me as his son's wife rather than as a person with independent identity or interests. He said that his greatest regret in his marriage to my mother was that he never took her seriously as an intellectual equal. He said that my mother was extraordinarily intelligent, had degrees from prestigious universities, had professional ambitions before they married. But he unconsciously positioned her as a supporting character in his life, rather than as the protagonist of her own story. He said that she had eventually accepted that role because fighting against it was exhausting, and because she loved him enough to make herself smaller so he could feel larger. Marcus's voice carried a note of something that might have been shame or sorrow or both. He said that he did not realize what he had done until after he retired, when suddenly my mother's activities and interests became more visible because he was no longer consumed by his own career. He discovered that she had been volunteering with a legal aid organization for 20 years, providing pro bono consulting to low-income clients navigating complex legal situations. She had maintained her legal knowledge, had contributed meaningfully to her community, and had done all of it invisibly because my father had never asked about her work or expressed interest in her contributions. The parallel to our situation was obvious and presumably intentional. Richard Ashford was offering his son a cautionary tale drawn from personal experience. What did your mother say when your father finally recognized what she had been doing? She said that she had stopped trying to make him see her years earlier because his lack of interest had been too painful to continually confront. She said that she had built a meaningful life anyway, independent of his recognition, and that she had made peace with their marriage being only one component of her identity rather than the defining element she had once hoped it would be. Marcus looked directly at me, his eyes carrying a vulnerability I rarely saw. I do not want that to be our marriage, Elena. I do not want you to make peace with being unseen. I do not want to be the man who requires his wife to be less than she is so he can feel adequate. But I also do not know how to be different from what I have been. I do not know how to suddenly become the kind of partner who celebrates rather than dismisses accomplishments that exceed my own. The honesty was unexpected and valuable. Marcus was acknowledging not just his past failures but his uncertainty about his capacity for change. That acknowledgement was more promising than defensive justifications or superficial apologies would have been. Change is possible, I said carefully, but it requires more than good intentions. It requires examining the underlying beliefs and insecurities that created the problematic behavior in the first place. You need to understand why you needed me to be small. What about your own identity felt so fragile that it could not tolerate being married to someone whose success exceeded yours? Marcus considered the question with visible discomfort. I think it relates to my father and the implicit expectations that came with being his son. Richard Ashford built something genuinely impressive. He started with modest advantages and created substantial wealth through intelligence and strategic thinking. I inherited his advantages without inheriting his exceptional capabilities. I am competent at what I do, but I am not exceptional. Ashford Capital Management performs adequately but not brilliantly. I secure clients through family connections rather than through unique value propositions. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline in a gesture that mirrored my own the previous evening. Being married to you, or rather being married to the version of you that I allowed myself to see, allowed me to feel successful by comparison. I was the one with the demanding career, the important meetings, the professional identity that mattered. You were supportive and decorative, which confirmed that I had achieved the kind of success that merited a certain kind of wife. It was all remarkably shallow and deeply unfair to you. The self-awareness he demonstrated was more extensive than I had expected. Marcus was not simply acknowledging surface failures but was examining the psychological architecture that had made those failures feel necessary. That examination was essential groundwork for any possibility of genuine change. What do you want from our marriage going forward? I asked directly. Not what you think you should want or what sounds appropriate to say in this moment, but what you actually want. Do you want to remain married to me now that you know who I actually am? Can you tolerate being the less professionally successful partner? Can you celebrate my accomplishments without feeling diminished by them? Marcus turned from the window to face me. I do not know yet. I want to say yes to all of those questions because intellectually I understand that those are the correct answers. But I also recognize that intellectual understanding and emotional capacity are different things. I might discover that my ego cannot handle being married to someone who has built more than I have. That possibility concerns me because it reveals limitations I would prefer not to possess. The honesty was both refreshing and sobering. Many people in Marcus's position would have offered confident assurances about their capacity for change, promises that sounded convincing in the moment, but proved empty when tested by reality. Marcus was at least being truthful about his uncertainty. I appreciate your honesty, I said, and I think we need time to discover whether you can become the partner I need rather than immediately assuming either possibility. But during that time, I need you to understand several non-negotiable parameters. Marcus returned to his desk chair, giving me his full attention in a way that felt qualitatively different from our previous conversations. He was actually listening now, actually absorbing information rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. First, I will not return to hiding my professional life or minimizing my accomplishments to protect your ego. The Vasquez Restaurant Group is my life's work, and I will discuss it openly, will attend industry events under my own name, will accept recognition when it is offered. If that visibility makes you uncomfortable, you will need to manage that discomfort rather than expecting me to make myself invisible again. Marcus nodded, accepting the boundary without immediate resistance. Second, I need you to actively demonstrate interest in my work. That means asking questions, visiting the restaurants, meeting my staff, understanding what I have built in specific rather than abstract terms. I do not need you to become an expert in restaurant operations, but I do need you to treat my professional life with the same respect and attention you expect me to show toward your career. Another nod, this one perhaps slightly less confident but still accepting. Third, we need to examine our entire marriage with honest attention to all the ways we have failed each other. I enabled your dismissiveness by hiding rather than insisting on visibility. You enabled my deception by refusing to ask questions that might have revealed uncomfortable truths. We both constructed a marriage based on convenient fictions rather than authentic partnership. If we are going to rebuild something real, we need to dismantle those fictions completely rather than simply adjusting them around the edges. Marcus absorbed these parameters in silence, his expression suggesting internal debate about whether he could meet these requirements. Finally, he spoke. Those parameters are fair. I agree to all of them, with the understanding that agreement and successful implementation are different achievements. I may fail repeatedly as I attempt to change patterns that have been established over 7 years. I need you to have patience with my failures while still holding me accountable to making genuine effort. I can accept that, I said, provided the failures are honest mistakes rather than passive resistance disguised as incompetence. If you truly cannot change, I need you to recognize that and be honest about it rather than stringing me along with superficial efforts that never produce meaningful results. Agreed. We sat in silence for a moment, both recognizing that we had reached the limits of what conversation could accomplish in a single morning. The real test would come through actions over weeks and months, through Marcus's demonstrated capacity or incapacity to see me clearly and celebrate rather than feel threatened by what he saw. "I have meetings this afternoon at Terre de Mer," I said, standing to leave. "There are operational issues that require my attention. I will be home this evening, probably around 8. Perhaps we could have dinner together and continue this conversation in less intense fashion." Marcus stood as well. "I would like that. And Elena, I want to visit Lumiere properly. Not as an ambush dinner but as your husband genuinely interested in seeing what you have created. Would that be possible?" The request felt significant, a small gesture toward demonstrating the active interest I had identified as necessary. "Yes, that would be possible. Perhaps tomorrow evening? I can arrange for you to observe dinner service, meet the key staff, understand how the operation functions." "I would appreciate that." I left our apartment feeling cautiously hopeful but grounded in realism. Marcus had said many right things, but words were easy while sustained behavioral change was difficult. The next weeks would reveal whether he possessed the emotional capacity to genuinely transform, or whether his good intentions would gradually erode back into comfortable patterns of dismissiveness. I took the subway to Brooklyn, a choice I made frequently because it allowed me to observe the city's residents in ways that driving did not permit. The subway car was crowded with morning commuters, a cross-section of New York's extraordinary diversity. I stood holding a pole and thinking about the conversation with Marcus, about the layers of self-deception that had characterized our marriage, about the possibility of building something more authentic from the ruins of what we had unconsciously constructed. Terre de Mer occupied a converted warehouse space in a Brooklyn neighborhood that had transformed dramatically over the past decade. Where factories and storage facilities once dominated, now restaurants, art galleries, and boutique shops created a vibrant commercial district. My restaurant had been an early entrant into this transformation, opening before the area's full gentrification, and therefore securing favorable lease terms that made the economics sustainable. The space was different from Lumiere's classical elegance. Here we had embraced industrial aesthetics, exposing original brick walls, maintaining high ceilings with visible ductwork, using reclaimed materials for furniture and finishes. The kitchen was fully open, allowing diners to watch the entire cooking process from prep to plating. This transparency created theater and education simultaneously, demystifying haute cuisine while still maintaining respect for the skill and precision it required. My general manager, a brilliant woman named Keisha Washington, was waiting for me in the private office when I arrived. Keisha was 39 years old, had worked in restaurant management for 15 years, and possessed the rare combination of operational excellence and emotional intelligence that made her invaluable. She could manage difficult staff situations with diplomatic skill, while simultaneously ensuring that every detail of service met exacting standards. "I heard about last night's revelation," she said immediately, her expression combining amusement and concern. "Laurent texted me this morning with the broad strokes. How are you managing the aftermath?" Keisha was one of perhaps 6 people who knew the full story of my hidden empire, and she had been consistently supportive while occasionally questioning whether maintaining such extensive secrecy was psychologically healthy or sustainable. Her loyalty had been demonstrated repeatedly over the 3 years she had worked for me, including covering for my absences when Marcus called looking for me, and accepting without judgment my need to keep my professional life separate from my marriage. "I am managing adequately." Marcus and I had a difficult but productive conversation this morning. He is attempting to understand his role in creating the situation and expressing willingness to change, though whether that willingness translates into actual behavioral change remains uncertain. For now, we are attempting to rebuild on a foundation of honesty rather than continuing the fictions that have characterized our marriage. Keisha nodded thoughtfully. Change is possible, but it requires genuine motivation and sustained effort. The question is whether Marcus feels motivated by authentic desire to be a better partner, or simply by fear of losing access to the lifestyle and status that comes with being married to you. Those different motivations produce different results. The observation was characteristically insightful. Keisha had a gift for identifying the underlying dynamics that shaped surface behaviors. I suspect his motivation is mixed. Some genuine desire to be better, some fear of consequences, some wounded pride that needs to prove he can rise to this challenge. The mixture may be sufficient to produce change, or the less noble motivations may undermine the more admirable ones. Time will reveal which dynamic dominates. And if he cannot change? If he discovers that his ego genuinely cannot tolerate being married to someone more successful than himself? Then we divorce, I said simply. I will not return to invisibility regardless of how much I care about Marcus, or how much I value certain aspects of our marriage. I have worked too hard to build genuine professional identity to surrender it again for the sake of protecting someone else's fragile self-perception. Keisha smiled approvingly. Good. You deserve a partner who celebrates your success, rather than requiring you to hide it. If Marcus cannot be that partner, someone else will be. You are not dependent on his recognition for your worth, which means you can make decisions about your marriage based on what serves your well-being rather than based on fear of being alone or diminished. We turned our attention to the operational issues that had prompted this meeting. Keisha had identified concerning patterns in food cost percentages over the past 6 weeks, suggesting either waste in the kitchen or theft somewhere in the supply chain. We spent 2 hours analyzing purchasing records, inventory reports, and prep logs, eventually identifying that a new sous chef had been systematically over-ordering expensive proteins and likely diverting the excess for personal use. This was the unglamorous reality of restaurant ownership that people who romanticized the industry rarely understood. Behind the elegant dining rooms and creative menus existed constant operational vigilance, financial analysis, personnel management, and problem-solving. Success required not just culinary vision but business acumen, leadership skills, and willingness to address difficult situations with clarity and firmness. By the time I finished at Terre-et-Mer, it was late afternoon. I had dinner service at Corbeau Noir to observe, followed by the return home to Marcus and the continuation of conversations that would determine our marriage's future. The day felt emblematic of my life's fundamental challenge, balancing the demands of building and operating a restaurant empire with the complex emotional work of rebuilding a marriage that had been constructed on unstable foundations. But for the first time in years, I was doing this work while fully visible, while claiming my accomplishments openly, while refusing to make myself smaller for anyone's comfort. That visibility carried its own challenges, but it was infinitely preferable to the exhausting performance of hiding who I actually was. Whatever happened next with Marcus, whatever our marriage became or failed to become, I had reclaimed myself. And that reclamation, I was discovering, created a kind of peace that had been absent during all the years of strategic concealment. The truth was difficult, but it was also liberating in ways that comfortable lies had never been. Marcus arrived at Lumiere the following evening at exactly 6:30, 15 minutes before the first reservation of the night. I had arranged for him to enter through the main entrance this time, experiencing the restaurant as a guest would rather than through the utilitarian pathways I typically used. Jean-Pierre greeted him with the professional warmth he extended to all our guests, taking his coat and escorting him to where I waited near the host's stand. My husband looked different somehow, though I could not immediately identify what had changed. Perhaps it was the absence of his usual confident bearing, replaced by something more tentative and observant. He was dressed casually for him, in tailored slacks and a cashmere sweater rather than his typical suit, as though he had considered what would be appropriate for observing kitchen operations and made an actual effort to dress accordingly. "Thank you for arranging this," he said, his tone carrying genuine appreciation, rather than the performative politeness that often characterized his social interactions. "I realize I have no right to ask for access to your professional environment, given how thoroughly I ignored it for years, so I appreciate your willingness to show me what you have built." The acknowledgement was a small thing, but it mattered. Marcus was demonstrating awareness that his presence here was a privilege rather than an entitlement, that my professional space was mine to share or withhold according to my judgment. That awareness represented a meaningful shift from his previous assumption that all spaces and all aspects of my life were automatically accessible to him. "I want you to understand what I do," I replied simply. "Not just conceptually but specifically. The only way to achieve that understanding is through direct observation and genuine curiosity. So I am going to show you everything tonight, from kitchen operations to front-of-house service, and I am going to expect you to ask questions when you do not understand something rather than nodding politely and pretending comprehension you do not possess." Marcus nodded. accepting the implicit challenge in my words. We began in the wine cellar, a climate-controlled space in the basement that housed approximately 8,000 bottles representing carefully curated selections from established regions and emerging producers. Our sommelier, a woman named Gabrielle Chun who possessed encyclopedic knowledge and exceptional palate, was conducting inventory when we arrived. I introduced Marcus, explaining that he would be observing operations tonight to better understand the restaurant's functioning. Gabrielle shifted smoothly into educational mode, explaining how she developed the wine program to complement Lauren's cuisine, while also offering selections that stood independently as worthy of focused attention. She described the relationship she had cultivated with importers and distributors, the careful financial management required to maintain inventory that represented substantial capital investment, and the ongoing education necessary to stay current with evolving wine regions and producer philosophies. Marcus listened with what appeared to be genuine attention, asking questions that suggested he was actually processing the information rather than simply being polite. He asked about profit margins on wine sales, about the turnover rate for inventory, about how Gabrielle identified which producers to feature. The questions were financially focused, reflecting his background in investment management, but they were substantive rather than superficial. We moved upstairs to the main kitchen, where Laurent was overseeing the evening's mise en place with his characteristic attention to detail. The kitchen operated with choreographed precision that came from extensive training, clear systems, and mutual respect among the staff. 23 people worked in coordinated motion, each person responsible for specific stations and specific preparations, all of it synchronized to ensure that dishes could be executed flawlessly during the intensity of dinner service. Laurent greeted Marcus with polite formality, neither warm nor cold, simply professional. He explained the kitchen's organization, walking Marcus through each station and describing the responsibilities associated with it. The fish station, where delicate proteins required precise timing and gentle handling. The meat station, where understanding of temperature and resting times determined whether expensive cuts achieved their potential. The pastry station, where Lumiere's desserts were created with architectural precision and artistic presentation. Marcus watched the prep work with fascination that seemed unforced. He observed a young cook breaking down a whole fish with practiced efficiency, transforming it from recognizable animal into portioned proteins ready for cooking. He watched the pastry team construct, elaborate plated desserts that combined multiple components into unified compositions. He asked Laurent about food costs, about waste management, about the training required to develop the skills visible throughout the kitchen. "This is extraordinary," Marcus said at one point, watching 3 line cooks work in tight coordination during a practice run of one of the evening's special dishes. "I had no idea restaurant kitchens operated with this level of precision and organization. I think I assumed cooking was more intuitive and less systematic." Laurent smiled at the common misconception. "Cooking at this level is deeply systematic, Monsieur Ashford. Intuition plays a role in developing dishes, in understanding how flavors and textures interact, but execution requires rigorous systems. We cannot serve 180 guests in a single evening with intuition alone. We require training, practice, clear communication, and respect for process. Your wife understands this completely, which is why her restaurants operate efficiently while maintaining exceptional quality standards." The compliment was delivered matter-of-factly, a simple statement of observed reality rather than flattery. Marcus absorbed it with a slight nod, perhaps beginning to understand the gap between his previous assumptions about my work and the actual complexity of what I had built. We moved to the private dining room where Marcus and I had confronted each other 2 nights earlier. The space had been transformed, set for a party of 12 celebrating a corporate milestone. The table was elegant with custom linens, carefully selected stemware, and centerpieces that complemented rather than dominated the setting. Every detail had been considered and executed with attention that most guests would never consciously notice but would unconsciously appreciate. "Who makes these decisions?" Marcus asked, gesturing at the table. "Who determines the specific linens and flowers and table settings?" "I do," I replied. "Or rather, I establish the standards and aesthetic principles, and my team executes them with guidance and occasional direct oversight. For standard reservations, the front-of-house manager makes decisions within established parameters. For special events like tonight's dinner, I review the plans personally and make adjustments as needed. The goal is creating environments where guests feel valued and celebrated without the hospitality feeling oppressive or performative. Marcus studied the table with new attention, perhaps recognizing that these details represented countless decisions and refined judgment rather than arbitrary decoration. How did you learn to do this? To create environments that feel this intentional and considered? Through study, practice, and paying attention, I said. I worked in restaurants for a year before opening Maison Verde. Learning every position from host to line cook, I observed how different spaces made me feel as both worker and guest. I studied successful restaurants and analyzed what made them function effectively. I made mistakes in my early ventures and learned from them. I developed taste through exposure to excellence and through critical assessment of my own work. We returned to the main dining room as the first guests began arriving for their reservations. Marcus positioned himself where he could observe without interfering, watching Jean-Pierre greet arrivals with personalized attention that made each party feel specifically welcomed rather than generically processed. He observed servers moving through the room with practiced efficiency, timing their approaches to tables to offer service when needed without hovering intrusively. He watched the subtle choreography of multiple staff members coordinating to ensure smooth operation. Dinner service at a high-end restaurant is a performance that most guests never fully perceive. They experience the results: seamlessly executed courses, attentive but unobtrusive service, perfect timing between dishes, but they rarely see the complex coordination required to create those results. Marcus was now seeing behind the performance, observing the communication systems, the problem-solving, the constant small adjustments that prevented potential issues from becoming actual failures. A table of 4 had ordered the tasting menu, a 7-course progression that showcased Lauren's current creative direction. Marcus watched as the courses emerged from the kitchen at carefully timed intervals, each dish presented with brief explanation that enhanced appreciation without overwhelming with technical detail. He observed the guests' reactions, their visible pleasure and engagement with the food, their animated conversation about flavors and techniques. "They are having an experience," Marcus said quietly, more to himself than to me. "This is not just about eating. It is about connection and celebration and being cared for in ways that feel both luxurious and genuine." "That is exactly the goal," I confirmed. "We sell experiences, not just food. The food is the centerpiece, but the complete experience includes environment, service, pacing, and the intangible quality of feeling valued. Creating that experience consistently, for every guest at every table during every service, requires systems and training and cultural values that permeate the entire organization." Marcus turned to look at me directly. "You built this. Not just this physical space, but this entire operational culture, these standards, this approach to hospitality. And you built it while I thought you were having lunch with friends and attending yoga classes." "Yes," I said simply, seeing no reason to soften the reality he was finally recognizing. "I feel like an absolute fool. I have been married to someone extraordinary and was too self-absorbed to notice. I minimized your work without ever bothering to understand what that work actually entailed. I owe you an apology that is more comprehensive than I have words to express." The apology was more substantive than his previous attempts, grounded now in specific understanding rather than abstract acknowledgement of failure. "I appreciate that, Marcus, and I think observing tonight has been valuable for both of us. You are beginning to understand what I do, and I am seeing whether you possess genuine curiosity about my work or whether tonight is performative effort that will fade once the immediate crisis passes." Marcus absorbed the implicit challenge without defensiveness. "That is fair. I need to prove through sustained attention that my interest is genuine rather than strategic. You have no reason to trust promises after years of dismissiveness. I will need to demonstrate change through actions over time." We remained at the restaurant until service concluded near midnight. Marcus asked to observe the closing procedures, watching as the kitchen was meticulously cleaned, as inventory was checked and recorded, as the front-of-house staff reset the dining room for the following day. He saw the full cycle of operation from preparation through service to conclusion, beginning to understand the comprehensive nature of restaurant management. We took a taxi home together, both tired but engaged in the kind of substantive conversation that had been absent from our marriage for years. Marcus asked questions about staffing challenges, about seasonal menu development, about the financial metrics I use to evaluate performance. I answered with the same level of detail I would provide to a business partner, not simplifying or softening the realities of the industry. When we arrived at our apartment, Marcus made tea, and we sat in the living room continuing our conversation. The physical positioning was different from our previous intense discussions. We sat together on the sofa rather than across from each other in defensive postures, close enough to suggest partnership rather than opposition. "I need to tell you something," Marcus said, his tone shifting to something more vulnerable. "I spoke with William Richardson this afternoon. He called to check on how I was managing the revelations and to offer some perspective. He told me that he has known about your restaurant since you opened Maison Verde, that he provided the initial capital, and has served as an informal advisor throughout your development. He said you specifically asked him not to mention your work to me or to other people in my social circles because you wanted to build something independent of any association with me or my family." Marcus paused, gathering his thoughts. William said that he respected your request but questioned whether maintaining such extensive secrecy was healthy for your marriage. He said that he warned you that building parallel lives would eventually create crisis, but that you felt you had no viable alternative. He wanted me to understand that your secrecy was not malicious but rather protective, that you were not trying to deceive me but rather trying to preserve something precious by keeping it separate from my dismissiveness. I had known William would eventually speak with Marcus once the situation became public, and I appreciated that he had framed my choices sympathetically while still acknowledging the problematic dynamics they revealed. William is correct. I kept my work hidden because I believed that was the only way to protect it from your minimization. I was wrong to choose secrecy over confrontation, but I made that choice from a place of wanting to preserve both my marriage and my professional development rather than forcing a conflict I feared would destroy one or both. Marcus nodded slowly, processing this framing. "I want to share something with you as well. Something that relates to why I needed you to be less successful than me. I told you yesterday about my conversation with my father, about his regrets regarding how he treated my mother. What I did not tell you was the rest of that conversation, the part where he explained why he had needed her to be smaller." He set down his tea and leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped together in a gesture of focused concentration. "My father said that he grew up in modest circumstances, that his own father was a factory worker who provided adequately but not abundantly. When my father entered the financial industry and began achieving success, he felt like an imposter surrounded by people who came from generational wealth and sophisticated backgrounds. He said he constantly feared being exposed as inadequate, as someone who did not truly belong in the elite circles he had accessed through professional achievement." Marcus's voice carried understanding of his father's psychology that suggested real contemplation. Having a wife who was brilliant and accomplished made him feel more vulnerable to exposure as inadequate. If my mother had been publicly visible in her legal work, if she had achieved recognition in her field, it would have created comparison points that might have revealed his own limitations. So he unconsciously minimized her work, kept her tucked away in supportive roles, and told himself that he was protecting their family life rather than protecting his fragile ego. I saw where this was leading, the generational pattern Marcus was recognizing. "And you have inherited his insecurity despite having more obvious advantages. You grew up with wealth and connections, attended elite schools, had doors open through family relationships. But underneath those advantages, you carry the same fear of exposure as inadequate, the same need to be definitively more successful than your partner to prove your worth." "Exactly," Marcus confirmed. "I have spent my adult life trying to live up to my father's achievements while unconsciously fearing that I lack his capabilities. Ashford Capital Management is moderately successful but not exceptional. I secure clients through inherited relationships, rather than through unique value creation. I manage money competently but not brilliantly. And being married to you, being married to someone who has built something genuinely impressive through her own vision and effort, forces me to confront those inadequacies." The honesty was painful but necessary. Marcus was articulating psychological dynamics that had shaped our marriage without either of us fully recognizing their operation. "What do you intend to do with this understanding?" I asked. "Self-awareness is valuable, but it does not automatically produce change. You can understand why you have needed me to be less successful and still continue needing that for emotional stability. Marcus met my eyes with an expression that combined determination and uncertainty. I want to believe that understanding is the first step toward change. That recognizing the pattern allows me to make different choices. But I also recognize that wanting to change and actually changing are different achievements. I may discover that my ego cannot tolerate being married to someone more successful despite my best intentions to overcome that limitation. What happens if you discover that? I asked, needing to hear him articulate the possibility. Then we divorce, he said quietly but firmly. Because you deserve a partner who celebrates your success, rather than requiring you to hide it. If I cannot be that partner, then the most loving thing I can do is release you to find someone who can be. I would rather be divorced and honest about my limitations than remain married while slowly destroying your spirit through continued erasure. The statement carried weight because it acknowledged the possibility of failure, rather than offering confident promises about certain transformation. Marcus was being realistic about his capacity for change, which paradoxically made me more hopeful about our marriage's viability than false assurances would have. We sat in silence for several minutes, both processing the conversation and the implications of what we had shared. Finally, Marcus spoke again. I want to propose something. A structured approach to rebuilding our marriage with clear accountability. I realize that sounds clinical and unromantic, but I think we need structure rather than simply hoping that good intentions will produce different outcomes. I gestured for him to continue, interested in what he was proposing. I want to establish regular practices that force me to engage with your professional life, consistently rather than episodically. Weekly dinners at one of your restaurants where you brief me on operational challenges and successes. Monthly meetings with William Richardson where the three of us discuss your expansion plans and strategic decisions, giving me context and allowing me to contribute from my financial expertise if valuable. Quarterly reviews where we assess whether my behavioral changes are substantive or superficial. He paused, considering whether to continue. I also want to attend couples therapy with a focus on addressing the underlying insecurity and ego fragility that created our problematic dynamics. I cannot change patterns that have been established over decades without professional help. I am willing to do that work if you are willing to remain in the marriage while I undertake it. The proposal was thoughtful and specific, demonstrating that Marcus had given serious consideration to what would be required for genuine change, rather than simply expressing vague intentions to be better. I appreciate the structured approach, I said. It addresses my concern that good intentions without accountability tend to dissipate when sustaining change becomes difficult. I am willing to remain in the marriage while you do this work, provided we establish clear parameters about what substantive progress looks like and what timeline we are working within. Marcus nodded. What timeline feels appropriate to you? How long am I asking you to remain in an uncertain situation while I attempt to change? I considered the question carefully. 6 months feels sufficient to determine whether real change is occurring, or whether we are simply delaying inevitable divorce. That provides enough time for new patterns to be established and tested against challenges, but not so much time that I am indefinitely postponing clarity about our marriage's viability. 6 months is fair, Marcus agreed. And if at the end of that period you determine that change has been insufficient or superficial, I will not contest divorce or fight about asset division. We will separate respectfully and acknowledge that incompatibility is not a moral failure but simply reality. We shook hands formally to seal the agreement, the gesture carrying both seriousness and a touch of absurdity that made us both smile. We were negotiating our marriage like a business arrangement, but perhaps that structured approach was exactly what our situation required. Romance and good intentions had proven insufficient. Clear accountability and structured evaluation might succeed where emotional appeals had failed. The following weeks established new rhythms in our marriage. Marcus attended dinner at one of my restaurants every Wednesday evening, observing service and asking questions about what he observed. He met with my management team, learning their roles and responsibilities and demonstrating respect for their expertise. He accompanied me to a food industry conference where I was speaking on a panel about sustainable restaurant operations, sitting in the audience and afterward asking substantive questions about the topics discussed. The changes were visible not just to me but to others who knew us both. William Richardson commented during one of our monthly meetings that Marcus seemed genuinely engaged, rather than performing engagement to satisfy requirements. Laurent mentioned that Marcus had visited Lumiere 3 times beyond our scheduled dinners, coming alone to eat at the bar and observe service from a guest's perspective. Keisha reported that Marcus had asked her detailed questions about labor management and staff retention, areas where his business background potentially offered relevant insight. But the most significant changes were occurring in our private conversations. Marcus began asking about my day with genuine curiosity rather than perfunctory politeness. When I described challenges with a difficult vendor or celebrations of a team member's promotion, he listened fully and asked follow-up questions that demonstrated he retained information from previous conversations. He started sharing his own professional insecurities with more honesty, admitting when he felt inadequate or when client interactions had exposed his limitations. We attended couples therapy with a psychologist who specialized in high-achieving couples navigating power dynamics and identity conflicts. Dr. Sarah Chun was 62 years old, had been practicing for 35 years, and possessed the particular combination of warmth and directness that made her effective at confronting uncomfortable truths while maintaining therapeutic alliance. She did not allow either Marcus or me to hide behind defensive narratives or superficial explanations. In our 4th therapy session, Dr. Chun asked Marcus to describe his emotional response when I received recognition for my work. He struggled with the question initially, offering socially acceptable answers about pride and happiness. Dr. Chun pushed him to go deeper, to identify the actual emotions beneath the appropriate responses. "I feel threatened," Marcus finally admitted, his voice quiet but clear. "When Elena receives recognition, when people praise her accomplishments, I feel like my own achievements are being diminished by comparison. I know intellectually that her success does not reduce mine, that accomplishment is not a zero-sum competition. But emotionally, I experience her visibility as my invisibility, her praise as my criticism." Dr. Chun nodded with clinical validation of his honesty. That emotional response emerges from core beliefs about your worth being contingent on comparative success, rather than intrinsic value. As long as you measure yourself against others, particularly against your spouse, any fluctuation in relative status will feel threatening. The therapeutic work involves developing a sense of worth that is independent of comparison, that allows you to celebrate others' success without experiencing it as your failure. The session continued with exercises designed to help Marcus identify and challenge the automatic thoughts that connected my success to his inadequacy. It was difficult work that required sustained effort and uncomfortable self-examination, but Marcus engaged with the process genuinely, doing assigned homework and reporting honestly when he found himself falling back into comparative thinking. 3 months into our structured reconciliation process, I received an invitation to be interviewed for a profile in The New Yorker about innovative restaurateurs redefining New York's dining scene. It was significant recognition, the kind of mainstream visibility that would make my work known well beyond the food industry. I accepted the interview with excitement, but also with apprehension about how Marcus would respond to such public acknowledgement. When I told him about the interview, I watched his face carefully for signs of threat or discomfort. He was silent for a moment, and I could see him processing his emotional response before speaking. Finally, he smiled with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "That is extraordinary, Elena. The New Yorker profile will introduce your work to audiences who might never have encountered it otherwise. I am proud of you." The statement was simple but significant, because it suggested that his therapeutic work was producing real change in his emotional responses. I tested the authenticity with a direct question. "Are you genuinely happy about this, or are you performing happiness while actually feeling threatened?" Marcus appreciated the directness rather than being offended by it. "I am genuinely happy, though I acknowledge that there is also a small voice in my head generating comparative thoughts about my own lack of comparable recognition. The difference now is that I can identify that voice as my insecurity, rather than confusing it with reality. Your success does not diminish me, even though part of me still wants to interpret it that way." The self-awareness he demonstrated was precisely what Dr. Chun had been cultivating. The ability to observe his thoughts and emotions without being controlled by them. "Thank you for being honest about the complexity of your response. That honesty allows me to trust that your support is real even while acknowledging that it coexists with challenging emotions." The New Yorker interview occurred in the private dining room at Lumiere. with the journalist spending an entire day observing operations and asking detailed questions about my background, philosophy, and vision for the future. She was particularly interested in the fact that I had built my restaurant group while married to someone in a completely different industry, asking whether my husband supported my work. I considered how to answer honestly without betraying private details about our marriage. My husband and I have had to learn how to support each other's professional identities while maintaining our personal relationship. That learning process has involved difficult conversations and adjustments. But ultimately, we are discovering that genuine partnership requires celebrating each other's successes rather than feeling threatened by them. The journalist pressed for more detail, sensing interesting complexity beneath my diplomatic answer. I deflected gently, explaining that I preferred to keep my marriage private while being public about my professional work. She accepted the boundary with professional grace and redirected to questions about the restaurant industry and my specific approach to hospitality. The profile published 6 weeks later. A beautifully written piece that captured both the operational excellence of my restaurants and the philosophical approach that informed my work. The article mentioned Marcus only briefly, noting that I was married but focusing almost entirely on my professional identity. When I read the published piece, I felt profound satisfaction that my work was being recognized on its own merits rather than through the lens of my husband's identity or approval. Marcus read the article the morning it published, sitting at our kitchen counter with his coffee and taking his time with the full piece. When he finished, he set down his phone and looked at me with an expression I could not immediately interpret. "This is brilliantly written. The journalist captured what makes your work distinctive. And I appreciate that she did not make your marital status central to the narrative. This article is about you and your accomplishments, which is exactly as it should be." He paused, then continued with visible effort. "I need to acknowledge something difficult. When I first saw that the article barely mentioned me, my immediate reaction was feeling erased, feeling like my existence was being minimized. Then I recognized the profound irony of that response given how thoroughly I erased you for years. You were living in that erasure constantly while I never even noticed I was doing it. Experiencing it myself, even briefly, helped me understand how destructive my behavior was. The recognition demonstrated growth I had not fully anticipated. Marcus was not just intellectually understanding his past failures, but was developing emotional appreciation for their impact through experiencing analogous dynamics himself. "That awareness is valuable," I acknowledged. "And I appreciate you sharing it rather than hiding your initial reaction because it seemed inappropriate or unflattering." Our 6-month evaluation point arrived in late spring. Dr. Chan structured our final therapy session before the evaluation as an opportunity for both Marcus and me to assess progress and determine whether we wanted to continue our marriage or move toward divorce. She asked us to speak honestly about what had changed and what remained problematic, to identify whether we believed continued effort would produce deeper transformation, or whether we had reached the limits of what was possible. Marcus spoke first, his assessment delivered with the careful honesty that had characterized his recent approach. "I have changed in ways I did not know were possible 6 months ago. I genuinely celebrate Elena's success now rather than feeling threatened by it. I am interested in her work for its own sake rather than because expressing interest seems required. I have developed a sense of professional identity that is less dependent on comparative status and more grounded in my own values and capabilities. But I also recognize that these changes are relatively recent and not yet fully internalized. I will need to sustain conscious effort to maintain them rather than assuming they are permanently established." He turned to face me directly. "I want to continue our marriage. I believe we are building something more authentic than what we had before, and I want to see where continued development leads. But I also want you to know that if you have determined that damage to our relationship is too extensive to repair, or that you simply no longer want to remain married regardless of my progress, I will respect that decision without resentment or recrimination." I took my time formulating my response, wanting to be as honest as he had been. Marcus has demonstrated real change over these 6 months. The changes feel substantive rather than performative, grounded in genuine psychological development rather than strategic behavior modification. I see a partner who is learning to celebrate rather than minimize my success, who asks questions because he is genuinely curious rather than because asking seems appropriate. That transformation matters profoundly to me. I paused, ensuring my next words would be carefully chosen. I want to continue our marriage as well. Not because I believe everything is resolved, but because I believe we are building a foundation for genuine partnership that did not exist before. We are learning to see each other clearly rather than through projections and assumptions. That clarity creates possibility for deeper connection than we have previously achieved. Dr. Chan nodded with professional satisfaction. What you are describing is mature love, which differs significantly from romantic love. Romantic love thrives on idealization and projection, on seeing partners as we wish them to be rather than as they actually are. Mature love requires seeing clearly and choosing partnership anyway, accepting both strengths and limitations while working collaboratively toward continued growth. You are transitioning from one form of love to another, which is difficult but ultimately more sustainable. We left that session hand in hand, both recognizing that we had chosen to continue building something together, rather than separating into parallel futures. The choice felt significant not because it resolved all challenges, but because it represented conscious commitment to ongoing work, rather than passive continuation of comfortable patterns. Our marriage after that evaluation point continued evolving in ways that felt increasingly natural rather than effortful. Marcus's changes became more automatic, requiring less conscious attention to maintain. My trust in his support deepened as consistent behavior over time replaced skepticism born from years of dismissal. We were becoming partners in the full sense, celebrating each other's successes, supporting each other through challenges, and building shared life that honored both of our professional identities, rather than requiring one of us to diminish for the other's comfort. The reconstruction of our marriage would never be complete, would never reach a state where no further work was required. But we had learned that ongoing work was not burden, but rather the natural state of healthy partnership, that choosing each other required sustained effort and conscious attention. And we had discovered that the effort, when approached with genuine commitment and mutual respect, created intimacy deeper than the comfortable illusions we had maintained for so many years. The New Yorker profile changed everything in ways I had not fully anticipated. Within 48 hours of publication, my phone began receiving calls from media outlets requesting interviews, from hospitality industry organizations inviting me to speak at conferences, from aspiring restaurateurs asking for mentorship, and from investors proposing partnerships for expansion into new markets. The article had positioned me not just as a successful restaurateur, but as an innovator whose approach to hospitality represented a distinctive philosophy worth studying and emulating. I sat in my office at Lumiere the morning after publication, looking at the list of interview requests that had accumulated overnight. There were 17 of them, ranging from local food blogs to national television programs. Each represented an opportunity to build my public profile, to establish myself as a thought leader in the industry, to expand my influence beyond the 4 restaurants I currently operated. But each also represented a choice to be visible in ways I had deliberately avoided for 6 years. The secrecy that had characterized my professional development had been protective but also limiting. I had built exceptional restaurants while remaining relatively unknown outside the immediate food industry community. Critics and serious food enthusiasts knew my work, but the broader public had no awareness of who I was or what I had created. The New Yorker profile had begun changing that dynamic, and the question now was whether I wanted to accelerate that change or maintain some version of my previous privacy. Marcus arrived at my office mid-morning, having texted to ask if he could stop by between meetings. He had read through the media requests I had forwarded to him, seeking his perspective on which opportunities merited serious consideration. This consultation itself represented meaningful change in our relationship. 6 months earlier, Marcus would not have been invited into my professional decision-making. Now his input felt valuable because it came from genuine engagement with my work rather than from assumption of authority. "This level of interest is extraordinary," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "The New Yorker piece has positioned you as someone with important insights about hospitality, leadership, and entrepreneurship that extend well beyond restaurant management specifically. These interview requests suggest that people see you as having broader wisdom to share." He pulled out his phone and opened notes he had made while reviewing the requests. "I think you should be strategic rather than attempting to respond to everything. National television programs like The Today Show or CBS This Morning would provide enormous visibility, but might not attract the specific audiences most valuable to your work. The Harvard Business Review podcast reaches exactly the audience of business leaders and entrepreneurs who might become investors, partners, or influential advocates. The TED Talk invitation is particularly significant because it creates a permanent record of your ideas that can be shared indefinitely. I appreciated his analytical approach, the way he was applying his strategic thinking to my situation rather than imposing his preferences or feeling threatened by my visibility. What about the Food Network offer? They want to develop a show concept around my restaurants and my approach to building the business. That would be substantial time commitment and would make me publicly recognizable in ways that might affect how I can move through the world. Marcus considered the question carefully. That decision depends on what you want your next 5 years to look like. If you want to remain primarily an operator focused on deepening excellence within your existing restaurants, then that level of visibility creates more complications than benefits. But if you are considering significant expansion, whether opening additional locations or consulting with other restaurateurs or developing some form of educational platform, then the visibility could be tremendously valuable for building the platform those expansions would require. The question he posed was one I had been contemplating since reading the New Yorker profile. What did I want the next phase of my professional life to become? I had proven to myself that I could build exceptional restaurants. I had created financially successful businesses that operated according to my values and standards. I had developed a reputation within the industry as someone who understood both the creative and operational dimensions of hospitality. But I had not yet determined what came after establishing that foundation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.